Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd President of the United States, 1889–93, a moderate Republican who won an electoral majority while losing the popular vote by more than 100,000 to Democrat Grover Cleveland. Harrison signed into law the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, the first legislation to prohibit business combinations in restraint of trade. Benjamin Harrison followed the distinguished example of his grandfather William Henry Harrison all the way to the White House, winning election as the nation's 23rd president in 1888. While his support for protective tariffs led to rising prices for consumers and arguably paved the way for the nation's future economic woes, his bold pursuit of America's foreign policy goals, including his proposal to annex the Hawaiian Islands, displayed his expanded vision of the nation's role in world affairs. In 1890, Harrison signed into law the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first piece of legislation designed to prohibit industrial combinations, or trusts. Before the end of his first term, support for Harrison was waning even within the Republican Party. In 1892, he lost his bid for re-election to Grover Cleveland by a wide margin. He remained active in public life as a lawyer and public speaker until his death in 1901. Though his father had warned Benjamin of the pressures of a life in politics, his wife encouraged his political ambitions. The young Harrison became active in state politics in Indiana, joining the fledgling Republican Party, which had been built on the opposition to slavery and its extension into the Western Territories. He supported the first Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, in 1856 and Abraham Lincoln in 1860. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harrison joined the Union Army as a lieutenant in the 70th Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and he would attain the rank of brevet brigadier general by 1865. Back in Indiana after the war's end, Harrison resumed his law practice and political activity, campaigning unsuccessfully for the Republican gubernatorial nomination in 1872. 4 years later, he won the nomination but lost a close race in the general election. From 1881 to 1887, Harrison represented Indiana in the U.S. Senate, arguing for the rights of homesteaders and Native Americans against the expanding railroad industry and campaigning for generous pensions for Civil War veterans, among other issues. A highly principled and devoutly religious man, Harrison broke with the Republican Party to oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which aimed to close the United States to Chinese immigrants. Due to its violation of rights given to the Chinese under an earlier treaty, the act passed without his support. Harrison lost his Senate seat after a Democratic victory in the Indiana state legislature in 1887, only to gain the Republican nomination for president the following year. Rather than travel around the country during the campaign, he gave numerous speeches to delegations that visited him in Indianapolis, an early example of so-called front porch campaigning. In a controversial general election, Harrison lost the popular vote to the incumbent President Grover Cleveland by 90,000 votes but carried the Electoral College, gaining 233 electoral votes to Cleveland's 168 thanks to victories in the key swing states of New York and Indiana, where Harrison's opponents later suggested that his campaign had purchased votes in order to win. During Harrison's term in the White House, the lingering effects of an economic depression led to calls for more expansive federal legislation. A longtime protectionist, Harrison supported the passage of the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, backed by the Ohio Congressman and future President William McKinley. For the first time in peacetime, Congress appropriated $1 billion during Harrison's administration, angering many Americans who saw the president and his fellow Republicans as too supportive of wealthy interests. On the other hand, Harrison lent his support to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which required the government to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver per month, and bowed to the pressure of agrarians and reformers by signing into law the Sherman Antitrust Act, designed to prohibit industrial combinations or trusts. Ohio Senator John Sherman sponsored both acts. Harrison also continued his support of veterans' benefits as well as his advocacy of forest conservation and the expansion of the U.S. Navy. In the foreign policy arena, Harrison's administration, including the President and Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, displayed a growing American influence in world affairs. The first International Conference of American States, later the Pan-American Union, took place in Washington, D.C. in late 1889. In addition, Harrison's State Department successfully negotiated with Germany and Great Britain to set terms for an American protectorate in the Samoan Islands and opposed Britain and Canada in order to prevent the overharvesting of seals in the Bering Sea. Harrison was unsuccessful, however, in his attempts to convince Congress to back the construction of a canal in Nicaragua, as well as in his efforts to annex Hawaii in 1893. Up for re-election in 1892, Harrison struggled to overcome growing populist discontent, including a number of labor strikes. In the general election, he faced Grover Cleveland again, along with a third-party challenge from the Populist, or People's, Party. The revelation that Caroline Harrison was seriously ill led to modest campaign efforts by both men and caused Harrison to limit his appearances in key swing states, contributing to the margin of his defeat. Caroline died of tuberculosis in late October, and 2 weeks later Harrison lost to Cleveland by an electoral vote of 145 to 277, the most decisive victory in 20 years. After leaving the White House, Harrison returned to Indianapolis and his law practice. At the age of 62, he married Mary Lord Dimmock, his late wife's niece and caretaker. They had one child. In 1898, Harrison served as leading counsel for Venezuela in the arbitration of its boundary dispute with Great Britain. After spending almost a decade as a respected elder statesman and acclaimed public speaker, he died in 1901 of pneumonia. Benjamin Harrison was the last Civil War general to serve as President of the United States. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, and was called Little Ben by his Democratic opponents. Nominated for president on the 8th ballot at the 1888 Republican Convention, Benjamin Harrison conducted one of the first front porch campaigns, delivering short speeches to delegations that visited him in Indianapolis. As he was only 5 feet, 6 inches tall, Democrats called him Little Ben. Republicans replied that he was big enough to wear the hat of his grandfather, Old Tippecanoe. Born in 1833 on a farm by the Ohio River below Cincinnati, Harrison attended Miami University in Ohio and read law in Cincinnati. He moved to Indianapolis, where he practiced law and campaigned for the Republican Party. He married Caroline Lavinia Scott in 1853. After the Civil War he was colonel of the 70th Volunteer Infantry. Harrison became a pillar of Indianapolis, enhancing his reputation as a brilliant lawyer. The Democrats defeated him for governor of Indiana in 1876 by unfairly stigmatizing him as Kid Gloves Harrison. In the 1880s he served in the United States Senate, where he championed Indians, homesteaders, and Civil War veterans. In the presidential election, Harrison received 100,000 fewer popular votes than Cleveland, but carried the Electoral College 233 to 168. Although Harrison had made no political bargains, his supporters had given innumerable pledges upon his behalf. When boss Matt Key of Pennsylvania heard that Harrison ascribed his narrow victory to Providence, Key exclaimed that Harrison would never know how close a number of men were compelled to approach the penitentiary to make him president. Harrison was proud of the vigorous foreign policy which he helped shape. The first Pan-American Congress met in Washington in 1889, establishing an information center which later became the Pan-American Union. At the end of his administration Harrison submitted to the Senate a treaty to annex Hawaii. To his disappointment, President Cleveland later withdrew it. Substantial appropriation bills were signed by Harrison for internal improvements, naval expansion, and subsidies for steamship lines. For the first time except in war, Congress appropriated $1 billion. When critics attacked the billion-dollar Congress, Speaker Thomas B. Reed replied, "This is a billion-dollar country." President Harrison also signed the Sherman Antitrust Act to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies, the first federal act attempting to regulate trusts. The most perplexing domestic problem Harrison faced was the tariff issue. The high tariff rates in effect had created a surplus of money in the Treasury. Low tariff advocates argued that the surplus was hurting business. Republican leaders in Congress successfully met the challenge. Representative William McKinley and Senator Nelson W. Aldrich framed a still higher tariff bill. Some rates were intentionally prohibitive. Harrison tried to make the tariff more acceptable by writing in reciprocity provisions. To cope with the Treasury surplus, the tariff was removed from imported raw sugar. Sugar growers within the United States were given 2 cents a pound bounty on their production. Long before the end of the Harrison administration, the Treasury surplus had evaporated, and prosperity seemed about to disappear as well. Congressional elections in 1890 went stingingly against the Republicans, and party leaders decided to abandon President Harrison although he had cooperated with Congress on party legislation. Nevertheless, his party renominated him in 1892, but he was defeated by Cleveland. After he left office, Harrison returned to Indianapolis, and married the widowed Mrs. Mary Dimmock in 1896. A dignified elder statesman, he died in 1901. Thank you for watching this video.